Hi theory students. Today we're going to be talking about modulation to closely related keys. And in this videocast, we'll be talking about pivot chord modulations and exactly what we mean by closely related keys. First, let's define modulation. Modulation is a shift of the tonal center so that one sense of the tonic will change. In a piece of music, except for the return to the home key, that is to say the original key, all of these modulations are temporary. That begs the question then, are we hearing a modulation, a change of key, or a tonicization, merely an emphasis of one of the other harmonies in our original key? This is not so clear-cut all the time. Much of the time, the emphasis on another tone in the key would run on a continuum from things that are less significant to things that are very significant. So sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between a modulation and a tonicization. Here are a few ways you could tell when you've had a modulation. A modulation usually involves one or more of the following: a predominant, dominant, and tonic progression in the new key, and/or a firm or strong cadence, think perfect authentic cadence or imperfect authentic cadence in the new key, often preceded by the predominant, or followed by music that continues in the new key. So we have a cadence, and then after the cadence we go on in the new key. Or if we have an extended progression in the new key, we tend to want to hear it as a modulation rather than a tonicization. As we look at more music, we'll refine this a little more and be able to tell the difference better. Let's define closely related keys. There are two definitions. They both will get you to the same set of keys, as I'll show you. One definition is any key whose tonic triad is a chord in the home key. So for example, if our home key is D major, the closely related keys are E minor, which would be a 2 chord in D, F sharp minor, a 3 chord in D, G major, a 4 chord in D, A major, a 5 chord in D, and B minor, a 6 chord in D. Notice we didn't mention C sharp diminished, since a diminished chord can't act as a tonic triad in another key. Let's look at the second definition. Any key, major or minor, which differs from the home key by no more than one accidental. D major has 2 sharps, of course. E minor, 1 sharp. F sharp minor, 3 sharps. G major, 1 sharp. A major, 3 sharps. B minor, 2 sharps. All 5 of those keys differ from D major by no more than 1 sharp, plus or minus. That's why, for example, E minor is a closely related key to D major, but E major is not. F sharp major is not. G minor is not. So we're not only picking the tonics of the closely related keys, but the modes that go with them as well, and it's a very important idea. So what happens in a minor key? The closely related keys to D minor, think about the keys that would differ by no more than 1 accidental to a key signature of 1 flat. So that would include F major, G minor. Notice A minor, not A major, even though we see a lot of A major chords in the key of D because of the harmonic minor mode. B flat major, and C major. So looking at the key signatures, 1 flat, 2 flats, no flats, 2 flats, no flats. And those are the closely related keys to D minor. Now let's talk about the most common way to modulate, and this is by means of a pivot chord. This is a chord that could belong to both the old key and the new key, making for a smooth transition. For example, and look at example 22.1 in your textbook, and play through this example on your recordings. If we're going from D major to A major, if one uses a B minor chord, it can function as both a 6 chord in D and a 2 chord in A, because the B minor exists in both of those keys. That's why we call it a pivot chord, or sometimes a common chord modulation. Let's look at a harmonic reduction of example 22.1. This time we're going to be looking at the first 4 measures that establish our key of D major. So in a harmonic reduction, 1 chord, 6, 2, 6, 5, 7, 1, 2, 6, and a cadential 6, 4 to the regular 5 chord, and it's a half cadence in the key of D. Now what happens in the next 4 measures will modulate to the key of A major. So the reduction here in the next 4 measures, measures 5 to 8 of that example, 1, 6, there's our pivot chord. I'll explain this in a minute, but what we hear now really only exists in the key of A major. So we get a 5, 7 in A, and then move towards a cadence. 1, 2, 6, cadential 6, 4 to 5, 7 to 1, and it's a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A major. In this particular case, this B minor chord here serves as a 6, 6 in the key of D and a 2, 6 in the key of A. In writing this analysis, we put a box around that dual analysis. We overlap the analysis in A with the analysis in D. The next chord, the E7, is not in the key of D, so we stop analyzing in D, but continue analyzing in A. And that's how we manage the pivot chord modulation. Which chord gets labeled as a pivot chord? Generally speaking, it's the last chord that can function in the old key. The next chord may be a 5 or other chord in the new key, but usually not a chord that works in both keys. So in other words, pick a pivot chord as late as you can describe it in both the old and new keys, but not once we're solidly in the new key with chords that didn't exist before. When we have a modulation from a major key to the key of the dominant, and that's the most common modulation from a major key, the most common pivot chord, as we've seen from the example, is a 6 chord in the old key, which is a 2 chord in the new key. This prepares 5 in the new key by giving it its predominant, and will lead to a cadence in the key. That is to say, the new key of the dominant. Less common is to have a 1 chord in the old key, which is reinterpreted as a 4 chord in the new key. This would work as a predominant of the new key, but it's a little harder to hear a tonic chord that we've just had as a chord in another key. Nevertheless, sometimes we make that kind of analysis. What happens in a minor key? The most common modulation is to the key of the relative major. And since these keys share a key signature, virtually any chord except a chord that's being altered by the harmonic minor, like a 5 or a leading tone chord in the minor key, can exist in both keys. The most frequent choices are those that can act as a predominant in the major key, like a 6 in minor, which is a 4 in the relative major, or a 4 in minor, which is a 2 in the relative major. But that's by no means the only choice. If you look at example 22.3 from a minuet, and in particular, look at measures 5 to 8. I'll give you a reduction of that in this example. Here in the book, they've sort of filled in the chords to show you what would happen. So we've gone from D minor to a perfect authentic cadence in the key of F, the relative major. If you look at the beginning of the phrase, from D minor, we have what would be a minor dominant chord, which we often see in descending bass patterns. But now, we have a C7 in third inversion, which acts as a 5-4-2 in the key of F. And in fact, it goes to a 1-6 in the key of F. So this chord in between the 1 in D and the 5-4-2 in F operates as a minor 5-6 in D and a minor 3-6 in the key of F. And that would be our pivot chord. As we look at more music, we'll get better and better at identifying pivot chords. And in the next video, we'll talk about modulations to other places other than the dominant of the major key or the relative major of the minor key. That's all for today.